Hello, everyone, and welcome to Found Friday, our weekly YouTube episode where we talk about everything marketing. I'm your host, Karen Skates, and with me today is Erin O'Brien, our own COO. Last week, we started a series based on Erin's experiences and some of the conversations she had with attendees at Content Marketing World. So this week, we're continuing those discussions by talking about what happens when a presentation or public discussion doesn't go quite as planned. So let's start talking about this from an attendee perspective. When you're in the audience and you realize a presentation or discussion isn't going exactly as planned, what are you hoping for? Or more importantly, what are you dreading as a reaction from the presenter?
I think sometimes maybe you're hoping it doesn't go as planned because you get the best stuff then. But I mean, in general, for when things really don't go as planned, I think that humor goes a really long way in handling a number of issues. It really makes the situation kind of more palatable for everybody and lets you know that the presenter is taking what's happening in stride, because the worst thing to see is like the actual presenter themselves freak out. Anger is obviously always a really bad reaction. It doesn't help the situation, and it can kind of stir the audience into a more negative feeling than they would have had if you hadn't gone there as the presenter. Really depending on what's not going to plan, there are a number of things that can be addressed. There's a really big difference between minor technical issues and major technical issues. There's also a pretty big difference between, someone going slightly off the rails and someone saying really inflammatory remarks. Pretty much all these things happen at every conference I've ever been to some degree or another. And my trip to CM World was really no exception to that.
Well, maybe we'll hear some details about that later. But I think being in the moment, using humor and minimalizing the immediate damage is one level of reaction. But what about after the fact? And I think there are a couple schools of thoughts here. Some people just say, ignore it, it'll go away, it's temporary, move on. Other people will go back and try to create some kind of a positive spin on a negative moment. So I think there's pros and cons to each one of these reactions. Let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, you're right in the fact that there are pros and cons to each type of reaction. I think that, ignoring it or, not dwelling on it or putting the focus on whatever happened is typically my response to things, especially the older I've gotten and the more I've seen these things occur. It really seems like when you emphasize what didn't go to plan or what did go wrong, you're probably drawing people's attention to it that maybe didn't completely notice it in the first place or that wouldn't have really paid attention. You're also probably drawing the attention of people that weren't even at the event unnecessarily. You're also bringing it up when somebody might have moved on to something else or another experience they would have had at the conference instead. And instead of focusing on, how to make the rest of the event, the rest of the content, the rest of like the specific thing that is happening, more of the focus, dwelling just is that, right? Dwelling. So I think that's a bad idea. I think one of the things that is a pro to addressing situations when they come up is it allows you to kind of take whatever happened and put it in context, kind of own the story yourself, figure out how to, tell the story and message it in your own way. Again, I think that there's a way to do that without emphasizing the problem, placing blame, which is one of the worst things you can do, or denying everything and acting like it didn't happen. I think if you're going to place blame, do any kind of finger pointing or try to say something didn't happen at all, then you might as well have just gone the complete ignore it route, because I think all of those things are worse than the original.
Yeah, I think there are times when you have to maybe not react to it, but maybe go ahead and do something that's more positive or something that's positive around that same subject. So if you have someone who's saying something negative or you get some kind of a negative reaction, not really acknowledging or referring to that negative comment, because that just gives it more weight, right? But then coming out with your own positive messaging on the same subject seems to be a way to handle that and to get your story out in front of your audience.
I think one of the kind of important to remember is while something may be all that anybody's talking about right now, this very instant, that it may not be the biggest thing that they talk about from the entire experience, right? So what you want to do is you do want to try to create a more memorable moment that is more positive and have that be the lasting memory, right? Like, you can't do anything about what's happening right now a lot of times because like people are talking about it. It's going to get some buzz. Things are going to happen, whatever. Accept that that's right now, but that you still have time to go ahead and make a new impression and create a better lasting impression than whatever that is, which is again is why my recommendation is not dwell on it, because I feel like that is what creates it as like the lasting impression, right? Is you keep bringing it up, like let it go.
Right. And the whole conference experience brings up some other issues like technical issues. And as we know, these can really rattle a presenter and can sometimes derail the planned content. So aside from kind of using humor, how can you recover from that kind of a problem?
You know, it's really a tough one because it kind of depends on the nature of your presentation. Like, how reliant are you on the technology? And since this actually just happened to me at CM World, I'll make kind of a few pointers to, you know, help make the best of a bad situation. You know, the first thing is I would say if you know your presentation inside and out, this will help you have a conversation that is wholly reliant on notes or slides at times. At least you have the content in your head and can usually speak to it in some sort of intelligent way, I hope, or you shouldn't be presenting. Kind of have a few icebreakers in mind, right? Prepared. So things that you can say to your audience, because standing nervously and awkwardly isn't a good lasting memory. And it also really doesn't promote you as a commanding presence. This is also where the humor thing really comes in handy. And, you know, I always say have backups of everything in multiple formats, right? So if it's supposed to be in a keynote presentation, have it in PDF, in PowerPoint, it, you know, saved on multiple drive types, like save it to Dropbox, save it to a thumb drive, save it to whatever, right? Like multiple iterations of something. When it comes to notes, have these things printed out. I mean, technology can be a fickle beast when it comes to crunch time. So there is pretty much nothing somebody's going to do technologically that's going to destroy your piece of paper. You know, so I feel like having it in, you know, a tangible format as well as in multiple formats available on technology and in something that's stored both locally and non-locally on your computer is going to be really helpful for you. You know, when I was at CM World, this was actually, you were mentioning you wanted stories, so I'll give you them. When I was at CM World, they asked that we submitted our presentations a few weeks early. And one of the reasons for doing that is to avoid technological issues with people bringing things in multiple formats and then it taking forever to get everything loaded when each presenter comes up as they change over. And that actually makes a lot of sense because having run conferences, you usually find that everybody wants to bring something in a different format and everybody wants to like use their computer and then they didn't bring like the right dongle and it's just like a massive issue. So considering we had to submit this stuff way ahead of time and couldn't make edits and didn't bring our own things and like it's not being presented off of our own computer, when I got up there, I was expecting to just be off and running. Instead, it took around 10 minutes for them to get this loaded because of some sort of technical glitch. And so for 10 minutes of a 30-minute presentation that's supposed to have 15 minutes of follow-up question time afterward, I was kind of standing there and had to, you know, figure out a way to converse with the audience, which ended up being fine. From a presenter, though, it does definitely rattle you a little bit because you are trying to figure out how to shorten your presentation. You start talking really fast because you're worried about time. I naturally speak really fast, so if you can imagine like a souped up version of that, it's terrifying. Yeah, but I mean, a lot of little things like that happen. Like I remember also our microphones didn't work at the end. So when people got up to go to the microphones to ask questions, you couldn't hear them. So because they're recording it and they're trying to sell the videos afterwards or like share the videos afterwards, I was trying to repeat back the questions, but in some instances I couldn't even really hear the person. So, I mean, it's a conference, right? Like you just kind of, as both a conference organizer and as a presenter, need to expect the unexpected and be prepared to roll with things. A weird example of this in a non-conference way was I was watching, I love the Today Show. I was watching the Today Show and Justin Bieber, who who's really surprised that this guy was acting like a jerk. But one of these cameras, because he was dancing around on this like Today Show stage thing, one of these cameras that was trying to record the concert didn't back up, I guess, quickly enough for the Biebs. And at the end of the concert, he, I guess, thought that the cameras and the microphones were turned off while they were switching to another segment. And you could hear him being like, "You can't be all within my space when I'm trying to dance," like screaming at this camera guy. So, you know, there's always going to be stuff that doesn't go your way. I think that the tips about like knowing your presentation, having multiple versions of it, and having a few icebreakers that you can use in case there is some kind of stall are probably the best you're going to do.
And always assume that you're on mic.
Yes, always assume the mic is on 24/7.
Always.
Actually, that happens a lot to presenters. It happened at CMworld. In my room, I was waiting, and the guy was getting off stage, and he thought he'd turned his mic off, but he walked out of the room, and somehow the mic got turned back on, and he was in the hallway, and you could hear him talking to people in the hallway. And I mean, it wasn't anything really bad, but some of it was not like glittering reviews of things.
Right. Yeah. So I think, and there are multiple examples where people think they're off mic. So until you've actually turned the mic over to someone and turned the off switch or unplugged it, assume that the cameras are rolling, assume that the mic is on. And so talking about sort of content going sideways outside of the conference arena, there are other examples of content not quite going the way you expected it to go. We've all heard those horror stories of the auto-scheduled tweets that just happen to go live in the middle of some tragedy, and it makes the brand look selfish and uncaring. It's not really logical to say, okay, then we just won't do any scheduled tweets, because for a lot of people, that's just how they manage that part of their marketing. But how to recover from that, I think, because these things are going to happen, right? So we're talking today a lot about how to recover. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think because we could all tell you a million things to do to prevent the problem from happening in the first place, and we don't want to focus on that because, you know, just telling you to not do it is like never going to be 100% the cure, right? So I think that when we're talking about recovery from having sent something out, this is a place where you do need to acknowledge the misstep, and humility is your best friend, and sincerity is your other best friend. I think trying to make light of it at that point is a really bad idea. This is like one of the places where additional humor may not be your fallback. I think that straight to the point, humility and sincerity in your apology is the best way to go. And unless you have really wronged someone or done something atrocious that requires like legal counsel, I think that if you just said something stupid, you need to apologize. You need to be sincere about it. You need to be humble about it. You need to try not to mess up again for a little while, give people time to get over your first mistake. And then I think you have to move on, right? This is actually one of the mistakes I see brands making every now and then is they'll say something stupid or insensitive, and then they'll keep bringing it up, being like, oh, we're going to donate 100 bottles of water to this thing because we did this, you know, wrongdoing, or we're going to adopt 75 puppies because we feel really bad. Like, dude, apologize, like, let it go. You know, people get it. Mistakes happen. Some people are going to be weird, but you just have to let weird people be weird because you can't solve that. You know, and when content doesn't go right, you know, remove the offending content, acknowledge the offending content, and then start creating new content that's not offensive and get that out there and try to give it some time, you know, just let it mellow.
Well, I think part of this too, especially when we're talking about social media, is making sure that you educate your employees. Because even when it says the tweets are my own, a lot of times you're still reflecting on your company because people are going to connect to you through those professional connections, right? So I think it's important for people to realize it's going to happen, and that people are going to tweet things that maybe aren't going to reflect as well as they'd like them to reflect, but starting out with the education program and setting those expectations early, I think, helps in this area as well.
I think that there's a lot of this comes down to management's poor education of people on what happens. So, and what I mean by that is, you need to know specifically if you write something on your personal Facebook page or your personal Twitter account, just because you happen to be an employee of an organization doesn't mean you're not also a human. And if you happen to write something that somebody at your organization disagrees with and they happen to see it, what's going to happen? You know, like, you need to know, are you going to be asked to delete that comment? Are you going to be asked to like remove that you work at that organization? Are you going to actually be held accountable for your private statements at work? You know, if you're not a public figure, if you're not a politician or the CEO of a large publicly traded company or something like that, if you're just an average Joe at a normal organization, I don't think that you actually should be held personally responsible for your thoughts and opinions outside of the workplace unless you are posting them under the guise of your work information. You know, I actually had a really kind of weird situation like this about 5 years ago. I was working with an agency and had a personal blog and a personal Facebook page, none of which had anything to do with my work life. And ironically, my blog was actually posted under a pseudonym. And I had like written some posts of just like randomly funny things that you encounter in the agency world. If you've ever worked in a marketing agency, weird stuff happens all the time and clients are crazy. I am a client and I'm crazy. And I know that. I know my agencies think I'm crazy. That's fine. So the thing was, I had posted this blog post that I had written under my pseudonym to one of my Facebook, to my Facebook page. And somebody from a client side saw it and assumed it was about them. Ironically, it wasn't about them. And
Just
so
another crazy client.
right. But what I thought was really funny was I was like, well, one, you assumed that this crazy is you, which means like you're kind of copying to being this person. And two, you thought that something that was written under someone else's name, posted to a private Facebook page, it means that you're like going to your agency people's Facebook pages and reading all their stuff. Like that actually does make you kind of crazy.
Well, I think there's a lot of that in that whole cross-pollination and how that gets separated out. I think people are still struggling with. But I think that when we're talking about that kind of negative comments and feedback and how the best way to minimize the impact, that makes me think of stories of that business owner who's refused services or tried to retaliate against people who've posted negative comments on social. Probably not the best course of action, right? So there's got to be other ways. I mean, I think that they do need to respond, but there's got to be other ways, more positive ways to respond, because there's going to be a negative Yelp review here or there, right? So what do you do? Or what do you do as a business person if your employees are kind of saying something that you don't want to reflect on your company? How do you separate that out?
You know, there are examples of this from B2B to B2C, spanning everything, right? Like somebody takes something that you said, did, whatever, they didn't like it, and they decided to go public and get super shouty and stabby. Yelp, from a consumer point of view, is a decent place to review things if something actually is not up to par. You know, I have kind of a personal rule, which is I ignore all 1-star reviews and all 5-star reviews, because I feel like 1-star reviews are all like flame war people who just are trying to create incendiary responses. And 5-star things are your family, friends, like your Nana and like your boyfriend writing posts, right? Because like most things are not actually like 5-star. This is the most amazing thing that's ever happened to me. Like, is it really that pedicure the most amazing thing that ever happened to you? Was that grilled cheese the most amazing thing that ever happened to you? Which is fine. You know, that's great because those things usually cancel each other out, right? That's always like extreme. So I typically read the 2, 3, and 4-star things because that comes from people that are level-headed who probably have had more than one grilled cheese in their life. So I think that, you know, when somebody posts something really negative on Yelp, I've seen businesses reply back and be like, we're really sorry you had that experience. We'd like the chance to try to make it right. Like, please come in for a complimentary, like, blah, blah, blah. Going on and disagreeing with the person and being like, you're a liar, you're wrong, and you have zero taste. Horrible plan. Even if it's true, it just makes you look like a jerk, because for everybody that's never actually been there, they don't know whether or not that's true. And you may incite people who have been there and actually felt that way and didn't write the negative post to take up the cause and defend that person and slam you too. So you gotta be really careful. If you're gonna respond back publicly, you need to only respond back with like the nicest possible intentions of, so sorry that that's how you feel. We would love to fix this. Where this actually is not the case, like the one caveat to this is libelous and slandery type things that people do. And that borders on legal issues. So depending on what your legal situation is, that's something to take up with them. So if somebody's posting something that is patently untrue and defamatory, you've got another situation. Although I think a lot of legal counsel thinks that this is like a really big problem in the social media age, because it's really hard to like prove all this kind of stuff. In terms of stuff in the B2B realm, this actually, you know, a good example is somebody that did this to us.
I was just thinking about that.
Do you remember a few months ago, we had sent out like emails to people that we have email addresses for. So like, we have your email address somehow because you at some point gave it to us. And we had sent an email out to people, and this guy, instead of responding to our email and being like, can you unsubscribe me, posted on Twitter, like, you think it's acceptable to email me, like, I hate you. And I was like, and like was super public about it. And at the time, my reaction was not, oh my God, people are going to think that like we are a bad company. My response, like my first thought was, I feel really sad that this is how you respond to email in your life, and that this is like your general MO. I replied back to him and said, hey, you know, like, I love your website. It's really awesome. You guys are doing great work. We'll totally unsubscribe you. Like, you'll never hear from us again. Whenever people do things like that, again, it goes back to, if you're going to respond publicly, you can just say, hey, you know, I'm really sorry that you feel that way, and I will attempt to fix this for you ASAP. For things that where somebody is attacking your business and your brand, I think send them a personal message, obviously, take it offline, attempt to diffuse the situation in a non-public way. For people that really won't stop and are continually abusive to your brand or your employees, that's when it's time to hit that magical block button. I usually like to reserve that as a last resort. Technically, legal involvement is last resort, but the block button is really my last resort as a company employee and as a manager.
Yeah, I was just going to say that in general, a lot of these things can be solved by just taking the conversation offline. Just saying, hey, I'm sorry that that's your experience. Contact me and give an email address, and just take the conversation somewhere else so it becomes less public, and then you can move on. Your social media network channels can then, you know, have more positive content instead of this ongoing conversation between you and maybe someone who thinks that it's inappropriate to email somebody with a certain title. I don't know.
Well, one of the things that I thought was interesting from the content world experience that's relevant here is, because it's both content from a conference as well as becoming social media, was John Cleese, who was one of the keynote speakers. So backstory on that is, Content Marketing World is hosted by Cleveland every year. It's where Content Marketing Institute is based. They have a lot of pride in their city, you know, and that's great. Like, people should have pride in their city. If you aren't proud of your city at all or don't like it, I don't know why you're still living there. But, you know, Joe does a lot of work. Joe Polizzi, who's been on the show with us before, does a lot of work to make sure that, you know, people really try to enjoy Cleveland, and they get the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame involved and a number of other local businesses. And so a lot of Cleveland was under construction this time, and Cleveland itself has had some, like, you know, recent news stories and things that were in nature. So during his keynote address, John Cleese was like, Cleveland is a horrible city. Like, it's disgusting here, and didn't say anything positive. And then he also said, I can guarantee you this will be a once in a lifetime experience. Like, I will never come back. And he also railed a little bit on the hotel that they put him up in, who was also a partner of the conference, which was, I'm sure, absolutely mortifying for both the conference organizers as well as Joe. But it was funny because somebody that actually owns an agency in Cleveland took to Twitter and took John Cleese's picture and then put over the top of it, "Cleveland is a once in a lifetime experience," which actually was the quote. They just didn't include the whole thing. So I thought that was amusing. I also think it was amusing that following the conference, Joe sent out an email, saying that he really does feel like Cleveland is kind of like the epicenter of the content marketing world, and that, it's growing and a lot of things are happening there. So instead of kind of saying John Cleese is wrong, he took the tack that you mentioned at the beginning, which was tried to focus it on kind of like a more positive outcome for the city itself. I think that that's a good example because there was a lot of conversation about John Cleese's keynote presentation, not just about his comments about Cleveland itself, but he's John Cleese. He says a lot of like kind of off the cuff things. He's a little bit sarcastic and snide. You have to know that going in. I think this also brings up a really good point of when you allow someone else into your content creation, it's kind of like being a circus tamer and being on stage with a lion, right? You, as much as you may have trained the lion, as much as you may try to control the lion, as many like little lion zapper things as you may have, sometimes you get roid and the tiger bites you. Like, who knows? Like, stuff just happens. And that's what happens when you work with talent that, you can't 100% control, and you're not going to control a film, movie star, author, person. You're just not. If you could, somebody would control the Beeb, right?
Yeah, and lots of other people who just rail against whatever. Speaking from experience, I'd say don't mess with the production crew. They can make you look bad, but that's okay. But speaking of negative PR, I think we get used to controlling what's said about our brand on the internet because we're creating the content. And that control is not as true when you send out a press release. The recipient of that bit of news can take any spin he or she wants to. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you shouldn't send out press releases, but you should be prepared to respond to unexpected reactions to your news.
Oh man, I don't even know where to go with this. You and I had this conversation recently because, again, this stuff happens not just to us, but it happens to everyone, right? And so we get to speak about our own experiences because this is our show. But we'd had a conversation with a journalist. You had a conversation with a journalist about a new feature that we were announcing, and he wanted details. And nowhere in his conversations back and forth with you did he mention that he was gathering points from other places to turn it into kind of like a back and forth devil's advocate, less than amazing reply. And he didn't say anything bad about us, and he didn't say anything bad about like our product. He just also was not talking about the feature we're releasing in a positive way or talking specifically about the feature. He was using us as an example. And I think the conversation you and I had afterward was interesting because it did not center around he has no right to do this and he's not allowed to do this, because that's certainly not how we feel. We know that this is like journalists' job. I think the conversation that we had, and I'd love to see kind of what the general world thinks about this, is if you are going to do something like that, we would just wanted the general heads up, right? So that it wasn't a surprise, because the idea is, I don't think that it should be that journalists feel like they have all the power and that, marketers, PR people, and advertisers need to beg them to write, right? Like, that's a terrible relationship and a way to do things. It also shouldn't be that people who work at really big companies that journalists are always clamoring for information about feel like they have all the power and they get to dole things out as they see fit and control things and not be forthcoming. I think that that's a terrible relationship. As a small organization, I just think that, like, if you know what you're going to do is not what you originally said you were going to do, and it goes against expectations, have the common courtesy to just give the person a heads up. Like, we couldn't have done anything about it anyway. The embargo was lifted.
Well, I also think there's something to be said, again, for building relationships. That in a professional world, as I see it, it's the job of the people within the brand to build the relationships with the journalists so that they can get the information they need when they need it, and to be available and willing to share that kind of information. I think there's also an onus on the journalist to build that relationship back. I mean, you don't have to ask my permission for what to write, but to say to me, hey, I have another opinion on this. I have something, an opinion that maybe doesn't match with what you guys told me. Would you mind responding to that? Or I'd like to give you the opportunity to respond. And
yeah,
even
the lack of opportunity to respond, I think, was also kind of, you know, an interesting thing. And this all goes back to like tie it back to what we're talking about here, is the real issue when we're creating content, because everything is content, everything, like press releases, white papers, conferences, this show, it's all content. When we're talking about creating content, even the content that we create and put it on our channels, we never know what's going to happen with it once we release it live, right? Like, we could release an ebook and somebody could literally take that ebook, download it, and then turn it into something horrible, right? Like, they could Photoshop it, edit it, do all these things. We don't know. Once it leaves our hands, it leaves our hands. It's our job to do a couple of things. One, create content conscientiously and think through all the ways that someone might use it, or at least try to think through all the ways someone might use it. Two, distribute it and keep an eye on it after you distribute it, and take ownership for what's live, even if it's been live for a year or two, right? Like, we all have evergreen content that's out there. You got to keep an eye on things every now and then. And three is, when content doesn't go according to plan, take ownership, don't overreact, and attempt to take individual negative reactions offline and diffuse the situation, as opposed to like continuing to make whatever this one-time thing is the thing that everyone's talking about. I think that that's really all you can do, because with the nature of the internet and all the sharing and everything that happens, trying to control everything is going to make you crazy and probably a much less productive marketer.
Yeah, I think the tactic of just being positive in your own communications probably will set you apart anyway. Just continue to be positive, put out your messages in a positive way, and don't get stuck in that spiral of either placing blame or apologizing too profusely, or whatever that looks like, because then that just adds fuel to the fire, right? That just makes whatever it is bigger than life.
Yep. I mean, that's all you can do.
So I think I would love if people could have reactions to this, or if they've had some similar experiences. I'd love to hear about them and what they did to solve those problems. And maybe some unique situations and solutions. And if I hear from anybody, we'll include that in our next episode, because I think that's an interesting conversation. But that's all we have time for this week. Be sure to join us next week as we continue to respond to some of the hottest topics from content marketing world, and discuss the technology challenge and talk about how much technology is really necessary for future marketers. Give us your questions and feedback at Karen@GinsandMetrics.com and Aaron@GinsandMetrics.com, or join the conversation live on Twitter at #FoundFriday. Happy Friday, and we'll see you next week.
All right. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.